Welcome, and thanks for tuning in to share this amazing story of the CSS Shenandoah, an anti-whaling Confederate raider, the story of which was the initial inspiration of what is now Seaworks, and where the MV Steve Irwin is moored. We are honoured to have Captain Watson read the chapter specific to the Shenandoah's visit to Williamstown shortly. I just want to give you a bit of background on my inspiration for the story, which led to the home of the MV Steve Irwin. Back around 2003, I created the Shenandoah Society to share the amazing story and importance of sharing maritime stories to champion Williamstown as a historic maritime seaport. It was decided by our small committee to host a heritage boat show and clean up the old Harbour Trust site to demonstrate the importance of sharing our rich maritime history. Like Sea Shepherd, all passionate volunteers who shared the vision. The Shenandoah Society changed its name to the Williamstown Maritime Association. The boat show was a huge success, around 30,000 visitors on that weekend. 2 boat shows later, the momentum grew, enabling the site to be preserved as a public place and leased from Parks Victoria. Seaworks Foundation was then created as an independent advisory over the site, now a true maritime precinct. There are many parallels between both ships, of which Captain Watson will share, specifically with the reading of the chapter of his recent book, The War That Saved the Whales, on Williamstown. Both amazing ships with amazing stories and histories. Now let's hear from Captain Watson.
Not many people are aware of the impact of the American Civil War on whales and whaling, nor are many people aware of the role that Australia played in the American Civil War and during the visit of the Confederate raider Shenandoah to Melbourne in January of 1865. I wrote a book called The War That Saved the Whales, and Chapter 12 is called A Warm Reception in Williamstown, which I would like to read. Williamstown, Victoria, Australia, January 25th, 1865. From 2005 through 2013, my ships and crew have utilized Australia as our base of operations to interfere against the Japanese whaling fleet operating in the Southern Ocean. At first, we were given a free dock at Victoria Docklands in Melbourne, and then later, a permanent base of operations at the Seaworks docks in Williamstown. In December 2007, when we first berthed in Williamstown, I was walking along the street and was amazed to discover a wall mural depicting the Confederate raider Shenandoah. As I looked out across Port Phillip Bay, I could see in my mind's eye the great black Confederate raider being guided by a pilot to this very place where my own ship, the black-hulled Steve Irwin, was now berthed. The support of the Australians for the Confederates is strong and enthusiastic. According to Goodall, the Shenandoah was given a hero's welcome, just as my ships were every time given the same when we entered an Australian port nearly a century and a half later. We passed on with our flag flying, numerous steamers, tugs, and sailing craft saluted by dipping their ensigns and in some instances by cheering. All greetings were felt and were returned cheerfully. Goodall added in his journal, cheer after cheer greeted us from the generous, brave-hearted Englishmen and Australians who believed in the justice of our cause. I marveled at the similarities between the way my crews and I were welcomed and the description by Hunt and the reception the Shenandoah had received. As soon as it became generally known in Melbourne that a Confederate cruiser had arrived in the offing, a scene of excitement was inaugurated which baffles all adequate descriptions. Crowds of people were rushing, seeking authentic information concerning the stranger, and ere we had been an hour at anchor, a perfect fleet of boats was pulling up towards us from every direction. The Shenandoah was thrown open to the inspection of visitors. As soon as this was known, and the news seemed to spread like wildfire, steamers and sailboats came flocking off towards us, and all day long and until far in the evening were plying between our ship and the shore, bringing on board and taking away thousands of persons, all eager to say that they had visited the famous rebel pirate. And the ladies in particular were well pleased when they could secure the attendance of a gray uniform to escort them on their tour of inspection. Of a truth, there are some curious phases in human nature. The following day, we were the recipients of some more tangible proof of the goodwill with which the residents of Melbourne regarded us. Each of our officers received a railway pass to go and return from Sandridge to Melbourne on the Hobson Bay Railroad, so long as we remained in port. Invitations to dinners and balls poured in from all sides, and everyone was particular to mention that he felt the warmest sympathy for the Confederate cause. All of this was agreeable enough if one did not care to examine too closely the sincerity of these friendly demonstrations, and after 90 days at sea it was pleasant to see the gay groups of women upon our decks, but the Shenandoah had come to refit, not to be exhibited as a curiosity, and this continual crush and whirl of visitors put an effectual check to the real business in hand. Consequently, when the first excitement had in a measure subsided, we were obliged to close our doors and hang out a most inhospitable and peremptory "not at home" to all callers. This prohibition caused considerable heartburnings, but necessity knows no law, and upon the whole, our popularity did not suffer. But after all, that tarry in Melbourne was one of the bright reminiscences of our adventurous cruise around the world. I do not suppose so much hostility ever was or ever will be shown to another ship in that port, and there are few, if any, who sailed in the Shenandoah who will not carry to their graves most pleasant memories of the days they spent on the shores of Australia. It is pleasing that, in fact, my ships have indeed been given a much greater reception, but given that the population is much larger and that our cause of stopping Japanese whaling is very much a cause that the Australians enthusiastically embrace, we can share with the Confederate sailors the fact that the Australians are indeed friendly and hospitable people. Another striking similarity was that in both of the visit of the Shenandoah and the visits of Sea Shepherd ships, the Australian public was very supportive, whereas the Australian authorities were less so. Public support was so strong that although the Australian government were under considerable pressure then by the American consul with regard to the Confederates and today by the Japanese embassy in regard to whale defenders, they could do nothing more than make a show of appearing to be strict with the visiting vessels. In our case, this was simply an annual routine raid by the Australian Federal Police in a fruitless effort to secure evidence of wrongdoing at the request of Japan. It's all very dramatic, but of no consequence. They did interfere with our importing bulletproof vests, which are illegal under the Australian law, mostly due to the legendary Australian outlaw Ned Kelly, whose gang had worn armor during shootouts with the constables. Being that our ships were not warships, we could not claim immunity to the searches, but the crew could refuse to answer the questions put to them by the Australian Federal Police and did exactly that. In fact, it became an expected routine for us to be searched by the Australian Federal Police at the conclusion of every campaign. They were acting on requests by the Japanese police and went through the motions, but there never really was much enthusiasm by the police to do Japan's bidding, and nothing much ever came from the searches. In a similar fashion with regard to the Confederates, the British were seen to be enforcing the Neutrality Act with regards to the Shenandoah, but not interfering with the repairs or fueling and provisioning. They were, however, interfering with the recruitment of seamen. The Australian government then, as now, was caught between a rock and a hard place. Then the people were in sympathy with the Confederates, but the government had to maintain a policy of neutrality, at the same time appease the Union and the Union sympathizers. With myself, it was the same story, with the people overwhelmingly in support of our anti-whaling efforts against the Japanese whalers in the Southern Ocean, and pressure from the Japanese government to detain us and prevent us from returning to sea. The political views ranged from enthusiastic support for the rebels to angry opposition from Yankee expatriates. The latter allied, strangely enough, with a curious group of British conspiracy theorists that believed Australia was about to be attacked by imperialist armies from North America. An editorial in the Sydney Morning Herald warned, "There is no doubt that the chance of invasion of this country by American privateers has roused the spirit of self-defense." This nationalist paranoia started to fester in Australia as early as 1856. By 1862, the Parliament in Victoria had already spent close to £1 million on harbour defences. Nonetheless, it was not an efficient defence. When the Russian warship Bogatar arrived for an official visit and presented a salute with their cannons, the Queen's Cliff Battery was unable to reply because they had neglected to purchase gunpowder for their guns. But pointing guns at the Confederate was the last thing on Australian minds. The Southern rebels were welcomed with open arms by most of the population, and this was all due in part to all the romantic tales they had heard about the exploits of the Alabama. There were even rumors that the most notorious sailor of the day, Captain Raphael Semmes, was aboard the Shenandoah. There were real dangers. Yankees and Yankee sympathizers were angry seeing the Confederate raiders sitting brazenly at anchor at the port in Melbourne. A Union merchant ship, the Mustang, out of New York, was anchored close in by in Hobson's Bay, and her captain and some of the crew decided to take action despite their status as merchantmen. They constructed a torpedo filled with 100 kilos of gunpowder and placed it alongside the hull of the Shenandoah in the dead of night. The trigger was a long line that ran through the water back to the Mustang. When the line was pulled, it broke and the torpedo failed to explode. The Yankee apparently lost their nerve and did not attempt a second act of sabotage. My ship, Bob Barker, berthed in Hobart, also suffered a bomb threat. A call to the Hobart police warned that a bomb had been placed on the Sea Shepherd ship. The police came to the Bob Barker with a request to abandon ship. No bomb was found, but the call came from a Melbourne-registered cell phone, and the man responsible was located, arrested, and fined. Captain Waddell and his crew were not much cheered by the newspaper reports they were reading. The three Melbourne newspapers, the Age, the Herald, and the Argus, all contained articles from the home front and for the Confederates. It was not good news. The Southern forces had retreated from the Shenandoah Valley, and there was little standing in the way of General William Tecumseh Sherman's army from advancing into Georgia. The fall of Savannah was imminent. The South was resorting to guerrilla warfare, and the only news that gave them cause to smile were the reports of the successes of Mosby's raiders in Virginia and a report of 10,000 Confederate troops under General Breckinridge routing the Union Army from Bull's Gap, Tennessee. More ominous were the reports that the Florida had been sunk, leaving the Shenandoah as the only Confederate raider remaining active on the high seas. The three newspapers expressed different points of view regarding the arrival of the Shenandoah. The Age was strongly pro-Union, and they wasted little time making their bias known to the public. Quote, "We cannot regard the Shenandoah as other than a marauding craft, and our officers and crew then a gang of respectable pirates. Her vocation is not to fight, but to plunder, not to vanquish enemies in a fair struggle, but to destroy unarmed antagonists, not to shed the blood of her crew in their country's defense, but to fill their pockets with prize money." The Herald retaliated, making reference to Captain Waddell's ship being manned by, quote, "a fine and determined-looking set of officers, and, with regard to the crew, a happy and apparently well-contented lot who express great confidence in their commander and are well pleased with the services in which they are engaged." The Herald did acknowledge that the role of the Shenandoah was to burn, sink, and plunder, but added, "We cannot but recognize and fraternize with the brave men who uphold their country's flag at the risk of being hanged at the yardarm." The Argus joined the fray with an editorial slamming Lincoln. Quote, "A government which has kept no faith with her enemies, and wherever it has been possible to do so with safety, has broken every promise to its friends. A government which under the pretext of a crusade against slavery, has committed crimes against civilization, more deplorable than slavery." The media took side with the Sea Shepherd's war against the whalers beginning in Australia in 2005, but we were more fortunate to have all the television media and majority of the print media on our side. The Australian has been the only blatantly negative newspaper, and the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald have been strongly in our court. The Australian referred to us as pirates, just as the Age once labeled the Confederate raiders as pirates, but this time the Age was backing us. The one other thing that had not changed much between the visit by the Shenandoah and the arrival of our ships was the friendliness and beauty of the Aussie girls. To the Confederate sailors, the bad news from the home front was quickly forgotten with the delights of Melbourne. The ladies practically threw themselves into the arms of the rebels, and Southern officers were quite talented in exercising charm, much to the annoyance of many Aussie blokes. Thousands of visitors clamored to step on board the raider, and amongst them were hundreds of very pretty Aussie lasses, all anxious to make the acquaintance of a Southern gentleman. This gave rise to some fits of jealousy from many of the Aussie men. In a letter to the Herald, one writer wrote that, quote, "Young females who go for cheap sentiment and electroplated wear were generally anxious to defile their boots with a nasty pitch this morning in order to gaze on the ultramarine chivalry of the South. This is all very well on the part of the stupid and frivolous girls who read sensational novels, but women have something higher and better to do in the world than to go sightseeing in such doubtful quarters." My officers and crew and myself also met the wonderful ladies in Melbourne and Sydney, Brisbane, Cairn, Geelong, Fremantle, and Hobart, and whereas the Shenandoah was recruiting men with great difficulty, we were able to recruit numerous men and women to join our crew. That, of course, would have been unthinkable in 1865. That was unfortunate for the Shenandoah because, in my experience as a master of many Sea Shepherd vessels since 1979, female crew members are more hardworking, more loyal, and complain less than the males. Captain Waddell had sent a request to the governor to undergo repairs and to bunker coal. He also requested permission to disembark his prisoners. In a letter from Captain Waddell to His Excellency Sir Charles Darling, KCB, Captain General and Governor-in-Chief of Victoria State, Sir, I have the honor to announce to Your Excellency the arrival of the CSS Shenandoah under my command in Port Phillip this afternoon, and also to communicate that the steamer's machinery requires repair and that I am in want of coal. I desire that Your Excellency grant permission that I may make the necessary repairs and supply of coal to enable me to get to sea as quickly as possible. I desire also Your Excellency's permission to land my prisoners. I shall observe the neutrality. I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient servant, James Waddell. Darling delayed answering for as long as possible, and then informed Waddell that he could remain important until his propeller was fixed and he was fully supplied. He then asked for a list of names of the prisoners on board and sent a letter to Blanchard asking if the United States was prepared to take responsibility for the prisoners. The decision over the prisoners soon became academic because within a few days of arrival, all the prisoners had simply left the ship on their own accord. Waddell sent a letter to James G. Francis, the Commissioner of Trade and Customs, stating, in regard to the list of prisoners, I have to communicate that all these persons whom on the high seas I considered my prisoners left my ship without my knowledge in shore boats soon after my arrival in this port. U.S. Consul Blanchard was able to interview the prisoners and from them learned that the Shenandoah was in fact the former British vessel Sea King and that the transfer had taken place near Madeira. Most damning was the report that the guns and the ammunition on the Confederate raider had been transferred to the Shenandoah from the British ship the Laurel. With the statements from the prisoners, Blanchard believed he had all the evidence he needed to stop Waddell. It was plain to him that the Shenandoah was in breach of Britain's Neutrality Act. He sent off letters to the U.S. consulates in Hong Kong and England, although such letters would not be answered for months. He knew that stopping the rebels in Australia would have to be his own doing, and so he dashed off a letter to Governor Darling. As he explained it, quote, as soon as I had reason to believe that the Shenandoah and the Sea King were one and the same vessel, and that she had not entered any port since leaving England, I took the position towards authorities here that she was not entitled to any of the rights of a belligerent as contemplated in Her Majesty's Neutrality Proclamation, and that she could not change her nationality at sea. Blanchard thought correctly that he had the Shenandoah dead to rights. It was a clear violation of the Neutrality Act, and he had the evidence to prove it. This put Governor Darling in a difficult position. If he seized the ship, it would be an admission that the law had been broken, and if he did not seize the ship, the Shenandoah would continue to burn and plunder American merchant ships. Darling knew that if he seized the ship, there would be an angry outcry from the citizens of Victoria, and that if he did not seize the ship, he would anger the United States. Darling had, however, polished his skills well and delegated the decision to a special council of legal advisers and then communicated to Blanchard that he would act once he received their opinion. Darling also made sure that he was unavailable to Captain Waddell, the representative of the Confederate government, and thus by avoiding both Blanchard and Waddell, he hoped to put off any decision. The experience of the crew of the Shenandoah mirrored perfectly the experiences of my own officers and crew in our visits to Australian ports, especially so in Melbourne and Williamstown, where the pubs provided free pints to anyone with a Sea Shepherd cruise shirt and invitations poured in for dinners, parties, concerts, and events. Metallica, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Nickelback on their tours through Australia invited us backstage with free tickets for their concerts. The Australian surfing gear company Quicksilver partnered with Sea Shepherd on a merchandise deal. Blue Tongue Breweries delivered a $250,000 donation along with 50 cases of Blue Tongue beer and a campaign to promote whale-safe beer to illustrate that many of the brands identified as Aussie were in fact owned by Japanese companies. I was even invited to a dinner with the Governor-General as a special guest of Senator Bob Brown of Tasmania. Fremantle and Casey gave us honorary home port status, and Victoria Docklands granted us free berthage in the heart of Melbourne. And as we were being shown such hospitality, we were also a source of concern for the federal government in Canberra. The Japanese government was not very happy, and although Australia was taking Japan to court over their illegal whaling activities in the Southern Ocean, there were still considerable trade considerations, and Japan wanted us stopped. This placed the government between a rock and a hard place because every time they tried to appease Japan, they angered our supporters. Captain Waddell and his crew had only to ward off the bureaucrats for weeks. We made a routine of it spreading over 7 years. Waddell had also to contend with the attempts by the U.S. consulate to trick him into more blatant violations of the Neutrality Act by sending in volunteers to deceitfully join his crew by denying their British citizenship. Waddell saw through this scheme, although he was in desperate need of new recruits. There were also rumors of plans to sabotage the Shenandoah. A carpenter working on installing a deck in the captain's cabin informed Waddell that he had overheard some Americans discussing a plan to smuggle themselves on board with the attempt to capture the raider after she put to sea. Waddell doubles his watch and challenged every boat that approached him from the water. The U.S. consul did enjoy some success with his offer of $100 to any man who deserted from the Shenandoah. 18 of the crew availed themselves of the bribe and slipped over the side. At one point, Darling was pressured by Blanchard to surround the Shenandoah with armed police while the ship was in dry dock in Williamstown, demanding that the vessel be searched for British citizens. Waddell refused. Melbourne's police chief, Thomas Littleton, responded by returning with a corps of 50 Royal Artillery and some 50 constables armed with rifles. A tense standoff was developing as the police took up positions surrounding the dry dock. According to Cornelius Hunt, quote, Captain Waddell preemptively refused to permit his ship to be searched or one of the governor's men to come on board, and in doing this he simply stood upon his rights and dignity as the commander of a cruiser, it being contrary to all precedent to search a man-of-war for any purposes. He also wrote the governor informing him that if the ship was not released within 24 hours, he should pay off his crew, return to England with his officers, and report the outrage to his own and the English government. The next day, Littleton withdrew his men, and Waddell was informed he was at liberty to proceed to sea whenever he so desired. That very night, the officers were invited to a ball in their honor at Ballarat, about 40 miles away, to which many of the officers traveled by rail. Hunt described this affair at the Craig Hotel called the Buccaneers' Ball. God bless the gentlewomen of Melbourne and Ballarat. They are remembered gratefully by the officers of the renowned ship whose official history was so brief but so brilliant. On the morning of February 17, just some 3 weeks after arriving in Melbourne, the Shenandoah loaded 300 tons of coal from the British collier John Fraser to supplement the 400 tons already on board. And the next morning on February 18th, the Confederate raider Shenandoah headed out into the Bass Straits and eastward into the Tasman Sea, then northeastwards towards the South Pacific Islands.
Thank you, Leigh and Captain Watson, for sharing the stories of our local marine heritage. In conclusion, the CSS Shenandoah scuttled 38 Yankee whaling ships, destroying their vessels, shot the last cannon of the Civil War, and was the only Confederate raider to circumnavigate the globe, and certainly the only one that became a tourist attraction in Williamstown and Melbourne. The result of the little stopover of the Shenandoah in Melbourne, well, the US proved that Australia, still a British colony, breached the neutrality in the Civil War, resulting in the US government, suing the British for $15.5 million in gold coins, around $1 billion in today's value. The Shenandoah changed hands a couple of times after the Civil War and now rests on a seabed somewhere between Zanzibar and Bombay. The Confederate anti-whaling fleet has been acknowledged as saving whale species and also assisting in modern-day anti-whaling tactics used by Sea Shepherd. Both anti-whaling ships, but different motives. The Shenandoahs to stop the lucrative whale oil financing the Yankees, and Sea Shepherd to defend, conserve, protect Australian marine sanctuaries, best known in the Atlantic for defending the lives of over 6,000 whales. As for the MV Steve Irwin, in late 2018, she was to be scrapped in Hong Kong. After all, she was 45 years old and not really suitable for the demands of Sea Shepherd's direct action campaigns. Realising what the MV Steve Irwin would mean to Williamstown and to Sea Shepherd for the ongoing education of ocean conservation to benefit Sea Shepherd, a not-for-profit was set up that now owns the ship and manages it. The Steve has been established as a mixed event space, bar, wood-fired pizza oven by 3 Grains, and museum with new ships tours starting in spring and summer 2020. Let's hope, after COVID. Not a bad way for a ship to retire. You'll have to come and visit. And finally, with admiration, respect and gratitude to Captain Watson and the Sea Shepherd board for allowing the Steve to continue to campaign in this way. Last and certainly not least, a massive happy Father's Day to all the dads tuning in out there, and a big happy Father's Day to my dad too. Hope to see you on the Steve soon. Bye.
In South Australia I was born, away, all the way. South Australia round Cape Horn, bound to South Australia. Hey, where you rule again.